The start of the Civil War actually begins with the election of 1860. The people of the United States went to the polls and elected Abraham Lincoln as the 16th President of the United States. Lincoln had stated, while running for president, that if he were to win, he would outlaw slavery all across the nation. And this upset many states in the South. Very few people in the South had voted for Abraham Lincoln. People were so upset that Abraham Lincoln became president that many in the South wanted to leave the United States to form their own nation. South Carolina became the first state to actually leave the United States when they voted to secede on December 20th, 1860. Shortly after South Carolina decided to leave, 6 other southern states joined them. These states would go on to form a new country known as the Confederate States of America. Tennessee had a decision to make. Was Tennessee going to join the Confederacy or stay in the Union? In January 1861, the governor of Tennessee called for a statewide vote on secession. The people of Tennessee went to the polls, and 54% of Tennesseans decided to stay in the Union at that time. But an incident at Fort Sumter in South Carolina would change Tennesseans' minds. South Carolina began taking over all U.S. federal property within the state. This included military forts and naval bases. The new Confederate soldiers were able to take over all of the bases peacefully except for Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter sits on an island near the city of Charleston, South Carolina. It was created during the War of 1812 to protect the city. Since it is on an island, it is hard to attack and even harder to invade. Let's take a look at a video on Fort Sumter to give you a better idea of what it looked like. The federal troops stationed at Fort Sumter refused to leave the fort. The new Confederate soldiers from South Carolina began to circle the fort, forming a blockade, not letting any supplies reach the fort. The idea was that they hoped that without supplies, eventually these federal troops would be forced to leave Fort Sumter and get out of South Carolina. The blockade lasted for weeks. The governor of South Carolina threatened that if any federal ships entered Charleston Harbor, Confederate soldiers would attack. The new president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, had a decision to make. Would he order U.S. federal troops to leave Fort Sumter in South Carolina and give the fort back to the state? Or would he attempt to keep the fort by sending a ship of supplies to reinforce the troops? Even though the governor of South Carolina had threatened to attack any federal ships sent to Charleston, Lincoln ordered the supplies to be sent anyways. When the U.S. federal ship reached Charleston, the Confederate soldiers attacked. The battle lasted 34 hours, but remarkably, no one died. Federal troops eventually agreed to peacefully evacuate the fort and give it back to South Carolina. The new Confederate soldiers had successfully taken the fort back from U.S. federal government's hands. President Lincoln was furious. He declared South Carolina was in a state of rebellion. And he called on 75,000 troops from across the nation to help the military put down the rebellion. A few weeks after the incident at Fort Sumter, the governor of Tennessee called for a second vote on secession. In June 1861, the people of Tennessee voted to leave the United States and join the Confederacy. Less than a month later, the first major battle of the war would take place. The Civil War had officially begun.